Also looking for internal consistency. They're making sure that the future land use map amendment is consistent with not only the comprehensive plan, but also state law. And in terms of transportation data analysis, you're making sure it's consistent with whatever identified transportation improvements are within the comprehensive plan. You're making sure that it would be consistent with level service, transportation concurrency. So there are several things you have to look at. There's several moving pieces within the transportation data analysis stuff to look at when you're dealing with the future land use map amendment. And in terms of the transportation improvements, you have to look at the transportation element and capital improvements element, because those will list certain roadway projects that could or could not deal with the impacts that you're seeing within the comprehensive plan amendment. Speaking of level of service, as you see the title of this slide, statewide level of service standards are now advisory. Review and enforcement of level of service has changed since 2011. During the time concurrency was being revised in state law back then, Rules 9J5 and 9J11 Florida Administrative Code, which provide additional guidance requirements regarding growth management, were repealed, and portions added to Chapter 163, Part 2 of the Florida statute. Now, during this time, a year later, another administrative rule was repealed, and that was Rule 14-94, Florida Administrative Code. Rule 14-94 contained a statewide minimum level of service standards for the state system, and also provided enforcement authorities to FDOT in regards to level of service standards on the state. With the repeal of this rule, that enforcement authority goes away. Now, however, the impact of this repeal removes the Department of Level of Service Authority in regards to the state system. There are still local governments that still use the level of service standards that are recommended by FDOT. So when we're saying advisory, what we're actually saying is that even though the enforcement authority for FDOT to enforce level of service standards on a statewide system is gone, they can still recommend that those standards be used. And those standards are found in FDOT procedure number 525-000-006E. And in essence, those standards are level of service D for urbanized areas and level of service B for everything outside of urban areas. And even though these are just advisory, there are still several local governments that still use these recommended level of service standards. Now, it's important to note that these level of service standards only impact roadways. There is no level of service standard within that procedure that's identified for bicycle, pedestrian, and other modes. Is there a question in regards to this, or?
Janine, I'd like to clarify. I think the procedure that FDOT adopted has also been repealed, and we have a policy that replaced, I think our policy is still in place, that adopts D and C. And I also wanted to make another note that local governments are still required under 163 to adopt level of service standards. What was repealed is the state mandated standards so that locals can develop what standards they believe are adequate for their jurisdiction. The other point that I think is important to make, and that is under the intergovernmental coordination element requirements, locals are required to coordinate with the entity that maintains the facility when they're establishing the standards. So for state roads, that would be the state DOT, of course. So they're advisory. We would recommend those in reviews for state facilities, but there's flexibility for locals in working with the maintaining agency on developing those standards. I kind of see this as similar to if you were working with a private water utility in establishing the standard for water, public water, you would work with that utility in establishing that standard. And the same should apply in working with AFDOT for establishing standards on the state highway system. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or points to be raised?
Yeah, this is Gary Sokolow, and just letting people know that currently the Department of Transportation is going through a study on how to better initiate and implement complete streets on the state highway system. And the area of highway level of service has come up a few times in our discussions, and I believe that you will see possibly recommendations from this group that talk about expanding level of service standards to different modes, and sometimes making the highway level of service less important than other levels of service or other measures of effectiveness. We have not officially done that yet, but I just thought I'd let people know that this might be on the horizon, that we are definitely aware that our level of service standards only covers the highway mode, and that some people feel there is a need to broaden our perspective.
There is also a level of service guidebook, and Andrew may want to touch upon that, because it does attempt to begin to address bicycle, pedestrian, and transit somewhat. But again, as Gary said, there's a lot of work being done currently to move us toward complete streets, more performance measures. So you should see a lot of work in the next year or so in this area.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you both. Any more comments or questions? All right, I'm going to move forward. I'm going to briefly talk about text amendments. I've already alluded to what text amendments were in another slide, but again, text amendments are those amendments that change goals, objectives, and policies within the comprehensive plan. Got into review of those text amendments dependent on what portion of the comprehensive plan they're changing to be found in section 163, 3177 of the Florida statute. The review procedures that you'll find for text amendments are going to be similar to flume amendments, and also they need to be internally consistent, not only with themselves and within the comprehensive plan, but also with state laws. Now, as I said, you could have text amendments associated with flume amendments. You can also have text amendments that are not associated with a flume amendment, so they can stand alone. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about future land use amendments in terms of future land use elements. Now, section 163, 3177, 6A establishes the requirement local governments have long-term future land use designations and those policies that support those designations. One of the most significant things in regards to future land use that would be something for reviewers to look at in regards to density and intensity is urban sprawl. Now, when I was talking about the data analysis required for a future land use map amendment earlier, I was talking about things such as suitability and availability of public facilities and services. During those analyses, it's required that they have to identify that the future land use map amendment is not encouraging urban sprawl. That means they have to discourage urban sprawl. Within the statute itself, there's a list of 13 sprawl indicators. And the sprawl indicators basically generally describe what's sometimes called leapfrog development, in which you have low density development that is relatively far away from existing infrastructure facilities, way out there. It's not connected to existing roadways. And generally, they're poor development patterns that can be costly for the local government and for the state in terms of resources and other issues. What a future land use map amendment should show is at least 4 of the 8 of what's called non-sprawl indicators. Non-sprawl indicators basically show that the plan amendment would promote efficient and cost-effective provision or extension of public infrastructure and services, promotes multimodal transportation systems like promoting pedestrian, bicycle, and transit where available, promoting the conservation of water and energy, preserving natural resources, basically placing development in its most appropriate place and using it effectively. Now, amendments can also impact what's called the transportation element. As I indicated earlier in this presentation, we were going to touch on 3 elements. This is one of the 3 elements, and arguably one of the most important for FDOT, which is the transportation element. Transportation element is guided by Section 163, 31776D of the Florida statute. The element is required to address mobility issues in relationship to the size and character of a local government. The purpose of the transportation element is to plan for a multimodal transportation system that puts emphasis on public transportation systems where feasible. And that will include, within that element, addressing existing and projected level of service for the transportation system, its needs, its deficiencies, and how to encourage multimodal transportation. The element must be coordinated with any applicable MPO in the area, transportation authorities, and FDOT plans like the Work Program or the Florida Transportation Plan. Now, within the statute, there's some minor differences for what's required in a transportation element for local government and what needs to be looked at during the review of a plan amendment which impacts the transportation element. And that will depend on whether or not the local government is associated with an MPO, and in some cases, of a certain population size. If a local government has all or part of its jurisdiction within an MPO, it has to have a stronger emphasis on multimodal transportation, including addressing traffic circulation, mass transit, ports where located, aviation, and other related facilities. Now, for areas that are outside of an MPO, or for areas with lower population that less than 50,000, they can address multimodal transportation systems as they can. Now, during the review of a transportation element transportation element in the plan amendments that could impact it, local government reviewers should be cognizant of whether the local government is associated with an MPO or a non-MPO, or what the size of local government is. Well, reviewers should also be cognizant of the level of service standards that are adopted within the comprehensive plan for all modes that are identified for local governments. They also look at multimodal strategies that are associated with what I was talking about within the statute, as well as right-of-way provisions and other mode requirements. And again, I'm going to keep harping on this, but the element and any amendments to that element must be internally consistent with the future land use amendment and all other applicable elements of the comprehensive plan. And last, not least of the elements that we'll talk about before diving into additional comprehensive plan amendment type is the capital improvements element. And I'm just going to go over this pretty briefly. Capital improvements element is guided by Section 160.31.77.3 and identifies the timing, funding, and funding mechanisms for capital improvements, including transportation improvements for jurisdiction. Many reviewers and local governments know that within this element, you have what's called a 5-year schedule. That 5-year schedule identifies capital improvements that will be completed within a 5-year time frame. In the past, local governments had to submit these 5-year schedules to DEO to determine whether or not they were financially feasible. That requirement in 2011 was removed. So just to let you know if you haven't found that out yet. And in addition, the capital improvements element must be internally consistent with the transportation element in any applicable MPO plan. Do we have any questions about the element before I move forward to transportation concurrency related amendments? Okay. Now, transportation.
I have a question here. I have a couple of questions. What happens when a transportation corridor or system does not have sufficient capacity to accommodate the impacts of a proposed development? Of course, that is the $30 million question, which fits into the, Miguel's question also, and that was about when it's not feasible to widen a roadway.
I can try to answer that, Gary, if you like.
Sure, yeah.
Well, I think the local government has several options, and typically those options are defined under the plan. They can adjust the development proposal that's coming forward. They can seek to refine the standards adopted for the corridor. Say they want to move toward more of a complete street corridor. They may take several actions to lower speeds, change standards. There are a variety of improvements they can make to accommodate other modes of travel on the corridor. They can have the developer contribute toward the improvements. So if they keep concurrency, there are going to be a number of options within the concurrency management system. But there are a number of other things that they can do, working to revisit land uses, revisit their strategy for level of service, and other things.
I have nothing else to add to that.
All right. Well, sorry, Janine. I'm just going to make a quick comment. We are running a little bit over the time. We're going to try and wrap this up in about 15 or 20 minutes, just to let everyone know how much time, how much longer we're going to run over. But with that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn this back over to Janine.
Thank you, Nathan. All right. Well, let's discuss the transportation related amendments. As you all know, transportation concurrency is no longer mandatory underneath state law. And if local governments choose to do so, they can rescind concurrency. I like to point out that this option is out there, but there's still a significant amount of local governments that still have transportation concurrency. And there's some local governments that don't. And those local governments that don't have alternative systems, like for example, Pasco County and Duval County have replaced their concurrency systems with a mobility fee system, which we will talk about that mobility fee system and other alternatives when we have the Chapter 5 webinar. For local governments that do keep transportation concurrency and have any amendments related to that, they have to follow Section 163, 3180 of the Florida statute. And there's several things they have to look at in regards to transportation concurrency, as seen on the slide before you. They have to make sure they have the goals, objectives, policies that correctly implement their transportation concurrency system. They have to have professionally acceptable methods for level service analysis and identification of facilities that meet those standards. They also have to allow applicants to satisfy concurrency requirements by entering into agreements for funding construction of improvements. They have to develop policies and other mitigation techniques to address negative impacts from development, as well as develop tools and techniques to complement the application of transportation concurrency within their jurisdiction. Now, in the past, before 2011, there were several types of transportation concurrency alternative systems that were within the statute. That was transportation concurrency exception areas, transportation concurrency management areas, multimodal transportation districts, and long-term concurrency management systems. These are not within the Florida statute any longer. They were removed around 2011. But there are many local governments that still have these systems and may want to continue to use these systems, and they are more than welcome to do so. There is an additional transportation concurrency alternative that local governments may use in regards to transportation deficiencies that is now available since 2011. And we'll go over this on our Chapter 5 webinar that will be, I think, on October 29th.
And mobility fees are authorized now as an alternative.
Thank you for adding that, Maria. All right. Now we're going into the last biggie portion of this presentation, and that's other local government comprehensive plan types. That's evaluation and appraisal review, which I mentioned earlier, as well as developments that qualifies as DRI, sector planning, rural land stewardship areas, as well as other planning innovations, which we'll touch upon at the end of this presentation. Now, many of you may remember what was called the Evaluation and Appraisal Report, or EAR, prior to 2011. It was a beast of an amendment process. Originally, local governments had a list within the Florida statutes of things to go over in their comprehensive plans every 7 years to make sure they were compliant with state law. That usually took maybe a year or two of doing the data analysis, submitting the actual report itself, and then going through and creating what's called year-based amendments based on that data analysis. Things have changed since 2011. Now it is the evaluation and appraisal review. Now, the scheduling for an evaluation and appraisal review is still the same. It is still every 7 years. and it is guided by Rule 73C-49 of Florida Administrative Code. Now, what's different is the documentation. Previously, when local governments had to do the evaluation appraisal report or EAR, they had to do a full-blown report, and it was data analysis and everything. And that served as your data analysis for what was the EAR-based amendments that came from that report. And what that report basically did was it went over the entire comprehensive plan, whenever where changes were going to occur within the comprehensive plan, either because of state law, compliance, or the local government wanted to change their community vision. Now, when your time is up on the 7-year schedule for your local government, the local government just has to send a letter of notification or notification letter to DEO or DEO. In that notification letter, it could be just one page identifying whether or not they will go forward and make what's called EAR-based amendments that will revise your comprehensive plan. Or they may just identify in that letter they will not do that, that they're compliant with state law. The letter just has to identify whether or not they are compliant with state law and whether or not they were going forward and doing their EAR-based amendments. The letter could be 1 or 2 pages. Some local governments decide to go through and do the entire report, so they just get the data analysis done with. But it must be noted that when a local government indicates to DEO that they will be doing EAR-based amendments, they must submit those amendments within 1 year after submitting their notification letter to DEO. Now, the prohibition that's associated with EARs, slightly different, but in some ways the same. If a local government does not submit this letter of notification about whether or not they're doing their EAR-based amendments, by the time the schedule comes up for them, they'll be unable to amend their comprehensive plan until they submit that letter. And there's a similar prohibition in regards also to EAR-based amendments. So please, when you're dealing with EAR-based amendments, adhere to the timelines that are within statute so you're not prohibited from changing anything with your comprehensive plan. And I'd like to point out real quick before I leave the EAR, prior to 2011, there was guidance on what local governments should look at in regards to looking at the comprehensive plan for state compliance, as well as changing their vision and what have you. All of that guidance now has been removed from the Florida statute. So it is up to the local government to decide whether or not they are compliant with state law. Now, if a local government decides incorrectly whether or not they're compliant with state law and they submit a comprehensive plan amendment that's not in compliance because of their comprehensive plan, that's on the local government to try to fix that issue. Now, I'm going to skip this slide, really. I'm just going to touch upon it very quickly. I only want to generally talk about developments of regional impact, and essentially those developments that would qualify to be a DRI, as we discussed it earlier in the presentation. And the changes came because of Senate Bill 1216 this year, which basically changed what new DRIs, how they would be reviewed and what process they would go through. So I'm just going to skip over this right now, and we'll talk more about it for the Chapter 4 webinar, since we also discussed a little bit earlier. And I'm going to jump into sector plans. All right. Sector plans are the new big kid in the block, if you consider that. You may have heard of sector plans such as Divisional, Latchwell, or Plum Creek, Sugar Hill, Bay Walton, and others. The majority of sector plans that you know about today have been developed and approved after 2011. So where did this program come from? Originally, it was a pilot program that was begun in 1998 which produced the state's 4 original sector plans. The grandfather of them all was Horizon West. Now, in 2011, the pilot status for this program was removed by House Bill 7207, and it became a full-fledged program which anyone could do a sector plan underneath. Currently, there are 12 sector plans in existence or under development, of which 6 of those sector plans came in for state review in the last 2 years. One of which is an expansion of an existing sector plan that was called the West Bay Sector Plan. It is now called the Bay-Walton Sector Plan, and it covers 2 counties, which goes to show how big these sector plans can be. And I like to point out that it is over 110,000 acres, and this is currently the 2nd largest. Another one that's under development called the North Grand Sector Plan, I think will be over 170,000 acres. So they're pretty large. The intent of the sector plan program was to provide an alternative to the DRI program. It was to encourage long-range planning and the conservation of natural resources. To be eligible for a sector plan program, it's kind of like getting on a roller coaster. You have to be of a certain height. For sector plans, you have to be of a certain size. Eligibility, you have to be at least 15,000 acres. And you could be within one jurisdiction or, like Bay-Walton, across multiple jurisdictions. Guidance and designation for sector plans is administered through DEO under Section 163.3245 of the Florida statute. Now, sector plans can be created one of 2 ways. There is what I would call a regular method. That regular method, and we'll get into the components of sector plans in a little bit, consists of the local government creating what's called a long-term master plan, which is one of 2 components of a sector plan. After they develop a long-term master plan, that goes through state review underneath the state coordinated review process and must be adopted into the local government's comprehensive plan. Or if it crosses multiple jurisdictions, all counties or cities impacted by the sector plan. That is the regular method. Another method that was instituted for those that had large future land use map amendments that adhered to the criteria, including the size eligibility of a sector plan, were allowed to become sector plans in 2011, and those are called future land use map conversions. Essentially what happened is when the sector plan program left its pilot status, the state wanted to give those who had a incredibly large future land use map amendments that could technically be underneath the sector plan program the ability to make those future land use map amendments sector plans. And only 3 were done. That was, as you see on the slide, the East Nassau Community Plan. There's also Rodina and Hendry County. That was another example of a conversion. And I cannot recall the third off the top of my head right now. But since then, you don't see flume conversions very much. You mostly see sector plans going the regular method. Now, as I alluded to, there's 2 major components of a sector plan. One is called a long-term master plan, the other called the detailed specific area plan. The long-term master plan is considered the overarching framework for the entire sector plan. That piece is adopted into the comprehensive plan itself. It provides all the overarching goals, objectives, policies, location maps, everything. What detailed specific area plans, or DSAPs, do is they implement the long-term master plan. These are 1,000 acres or more, and they basically implement portions of the sector plan, and they're adopted by local development order. since there's two main components of the sector plan there are two levels of review. As we were just talking about, the first level of review would be the state coordinator review for the long-term master plan itself. When reviewers are looking at the long-term master plan, they need to be looking at the requirements underneath Section 163, 3245-3A of the Florida statute, which details what should be contained within a long-term master plan. And that includes not only the goals, objectives, policies, but also data analysis. The other level of review is when you get to the DSAP stage. DSAP, their requirements and review are found underneath Section 163, 3245-3F. Now, a change for DSAP that happened this year is the review of a DSAP. Prior to 2015, the review of the DSAP was primarily through DO, and DO to coordinate with other state agencies, but DO was the only one to review a adopted or approved local development order for a DSAP. And
actually,
whether or not sorry.
That was one of the changes in statute this year, is that all the commenting agencies.
Yeah,
so,
I was just, sorry about that. I was just talking about what was prior to 2015. I didn't mean to confuse. Sorry, Maria. So essentially, prior to 2015, it was DAO looking at the DSAP as an approved local development order, and checking to ensure that it was consistent with the long-term master plan. As Maria was about to talk about, with changes in Senate Bill 1216 for December 2015, we now have a 30-day review period for reviewing agencies in regards to DSAP. And this is a little different, because instead of reviewing DAO, reviewing at the adopted local development order stage, when an applicant develops a proposed DSAP, they are required now to send their proposed DSAP application for review by reviewing agencies. That will include FDOT. So FDOT now has the ability underneath Florida statute to review a proposed DSAP and submit comments. And they must submit comments directly to the local government within 30 days of receipt of the proposed DSAP. After that happens, the applicant must address the comments identified during a 30-day review period in their development of their final proposed DSAP application, which would then go to local government for approval. At that stage, it then goes back to what was happening originally prior to 2015, in which DAO would then be the recipient of the approved local development order, in which then they will review to see if it adheres to the long-term master plan, goals, objectives, policies, as well as internal consistency with the plan itself, like other state laws. And so,
if I can add a comment here, Janine.
Sure.
When we're reviewing the DSAP, we're limited to the review for consistency against the long-term master plan. And since the purpose of the sector plan is to replace the DRI process, one of the issues of concern to FDOT will be to look at those extra-jurisdictional impacts to important state resources and facilities. So under the sector plan legislation, the requirements at the long-term master plan are fairly general. So the mitigation does not really happen until the detailed specific area plan is done. What's required at the long-term master plan is to generally identify the facilities and services needed to support the long-term master plan. And the sector plan needs to have procedures for working with and addressing those extra jurisdictional impacts. So it's critical that the long-term master plan establish a good set of procedures to work through and identify a process to work with the agencies to address those extra jurisdictional impacts, because again, the mitigation is not really required until you prepare the DSAP.
Thank you, Maria. Actually, before I leave this part, does anyone have questions on sector plans really quick? I'm going to jump and talk briefly then about rural land stewardship areas. This is another big program under growth management, which began in 2001. And this program was revised with House Bill 7207 in 2011 and was finally given its own guiding statute, which is Section 153-3248. Now, rural land stewardship areas are intended for predominantly rural areas for long-range planning purposes. For an area to be eligible to become a rural land stewardship area, it has to be at least 10,000 acres or more outside of any urban areas or any urban service areas. It must be designated by a plan amendment as an overlay. And just as a note, similar to sector plans, rural land stewardship areas can cross more than one county. Now, sector plan, no, my apologies. Rural land stewardship areas, the overlay amendment itself is initiated by the landowners and must be submitted for state review underneath the state coordinated review process. Now, currently, there's only 2 counties within the state of Florida that has rural land stewardship areas. That's Collier County and St. Lucie County. So what would an RLSA comprehensive plan amendment consist of? This consists of 3 major things. Criteria for designated stewardship receiving areas, SRAs, and stewardship sending areas, or SSAs. Now, SSAs and SRAs are being used here to guide development to more appropriate places while protecting agricultural lands and activities, as well as other traditional rural land uses in the natural environment itself. The plan amendment itself will also contain innovative planning and development strategies and associated implementation processes regarding the functional land uses and other stewardship functions. The plan amendment would consist of a mixture of densities which would discourage urban sprawl and protect natural resources. In total, this comprehensive plan amendment is supposed to promote rural land stewardship areas and protect the rural lands, as well as stimulate economic growth and diversification of the economy. Now, the slide before you, you're going to see is an example of an RLSA map from Collier County. And as I identified previously on the slide, there are some main components of an RLSA. There's the SRAs, SSAs, and what's called setting area stewardship credits, which are associated with the SSAs. So, as I said, these credits are obtained from SSAs, which enables development to occur in SRAs. And these credits are determined by a credit worksheet that's developed by the local government. Now, you're looking on your screen, you're noticing that the SRA here is Ave Maria. You notice that it seems to be incredibly urbanized compared to the other sending areas. So this is showing how, this map is showing how Collier County is protecting these other areas for natural resources and agricultural uses and placing urban uses in a more appropriate area to allow for the economy to continue on without being detrimented by fracturing or what have you. And on the bottom of this slide, you'll see it when you get a handout for this presentation, is a link to Collier County's example that I'm showing on the screen. Now, another example from Collier County, as I was just alluding to, is the stewardship credit worksheet. And this worksheet tells the applicant basically what kind of credits you could get for what type of areas they're spending development from for density and intensity purposes. And this is an example of a study area. You have to do a significant amount of data analysis, especially with a rural land stewardship area, and that is detailed in the handbook. And one of the things is basically making note of the natural resources that you'll be looking at in terms of developing your stewardship spending areas. Finally, I will end on section 3.9.5 of chapter 3. And that is planning innovations. So in House Bill 7207 in 2011, section 163.31.68 got encouraged and updated. Within this section, the legislature wanted to promote innovative planning tools and also required DAO to coordinate with agencies to provide technical assistance to local governments that are trying to use these innovative planning tools. Innovative planning tools identified by the statute include but are not limited to visioning, sector planning, and rural land stewardship area designations. Other planning innovations that examples that might be you can see now in terms of coordination, such as the FDOT's multimodal mobility review planning guide and FDOT's multimodal transportation best practices and model elements.
I will mention we're doing a series of training sessions that combine the mobility review guide training with the multimodal transportation best practices training, and working with Gary, we'll put a notice out to you all on the availability of future trainings on those topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maria. And the trainings that we have done in the past on this, we have the materials available on it, and we will get you links to those, and got a lot of good reviews on the training that Maria just talked about. So stay in touch.
So for those that are still with us, do you have any questions of what we covered today?
Gary, are we able to unmute the lines in case folks want to ask questions?
Yes, we can. If there is somebody who's raised their hand, let's say, and would like to speak, yes, we can unmute them. If they put in their PIN or if they have a working microphone. But I don't see anybody with their hands up. Has somebody asked to talk? Okay.
I think there was a question about whether we could provide access to the level of service policy and the guidebook.
Let me state that I put those in the handouts, which people can download right from their current panels that they have.
And there is some guidance there for bike, ped, and transit.
Well, not in the LOS policy.
But in the guidebook.
In the guidebook, it's not really guidance on what LOS we should use, but there is guidance on how to measure and determine and plan for. So, yeah. But what you have available, for those of you that haven't downloaded it, is our current LOS policy, the handout from today, and I also included FDOT's Complete Streets Policy Initiative Policy Statement. And we will, in our summary to this, get you links to all the things that Janine, Maria, and I have spoken about today. If there are no other questions, Janine, could you go to page 70, to slide 70? Okay, these are the remaining chapters that we have planned. So we have one in September and one in October. You have already signed up for it. So, Janine, if you would go at this point to slide 73. Okay. What you have here is all the people that you can get in touch with any questions that weren't answered today or weren't answered to your satisfaction. You can bother us. So we're all here, and I would like to thank you. I'm looking to see if we had any more questions. Okay, very good. Where are the presentations saved so we can review what we had to miss? We will, in our summary to everybody who has signed up for the class, not just those of you who attended, we will have links to the recorded session as well as to the presentation, so you should be able to give this to your coworkers that weren't able to make it or had to leave sooner. So with that, I would like to thank our main speakers today, Janine Fear and Maria, for helping us out, and thank you for your interest in the subject. And with that, since there are no more questions, have a great rest of your day, and we'll hopefully see you next month. Thank you very much. I will end, or actually, Janine, I think you have to hit the X.
I will do that as soon as I find it.